Well, hello again, English 1101. It's Hogan, Mr. Shack, back again. We're heading into paper one, which is going to be a whole lot of work, as you guys know. Not so much in the amount that you'll have to write, because there's not a set required amount of pages. It's just whatever you need, whatever length you need to get the job done. But just in the actual mental work it'll take for you to respond to open-ended prompts. Because I'm not looking for this like high school fill in the blank, recite these rules and fill in these slots. Like that stuff has its place, and learning those writing moves helps you become a more clear writer. But it doesn't do anything necessarily to help you say anything interesting or to help you just enjoy reading and writing. And I think if there's one thing I can do in this class that I'd really love to do is for you to leave with a sense of writing as a mysterious exploration of interesting ideas and expanding of yourself. Just something that you take on and practice the rest of your life, because reading gives us windows into other people and writing gives us windows into ourselves, and that's what this first essay, this personal narrative, is going to be all about. You'll notice that the Little Seagull Handbook readings this week are going to be a lot about what structures you can use for a personal narrative or an exploratory narrative, and just play around with those. I want to see you guys engaging with thoughts, putting them in funny places, and as we talk about with Dodie, I really want you guys to get this sense of exploring where structure is not so important, and then you can focus later on making it clear what you're going to say. We'll get into that soon. I wanted to address these three buzzwords in the field of composition, English composition, which is what you're taking right now. They're not words I use very much because I like the freedom of you guys coming up with your own vocabulary for stuff. I think that's so much fun. And like whenever you have to memorize stuff in a class that's about exploring ideas, for me anyway, that's always kind of made the experience kind of a drudgery. Not my favorite thing. I'm sure some of you feel similarly. But I want you to know these three buzzwords and kind of what they mean, because when you head into your next class or when you're talking to other people at this university who take composition, they're going to know these three words. So note them down. I'll bring them back up in videos later so that they're on your mind. But they're the concepts we're using in this class all the time, but that I'm just going to let you call whatever you call, and I'll call them what I call them. I think that's much more interesting. The first one is ethos. And ethos is pretty much, it's an old Greek word, and it's pretty much this idea that everyone, whenever they're speaking or writing or whatever, they have this kind of ethical presence. Like when you're reading Wallace, do you trust Wallace? Do you think he's trying to trick you? Or does he show you in his writing that you can trust him and that he's honestly exploring something? I think he's pretty honestly exploring, and he seems like a very genuine person. So you could say that he has kind of a positive ethos where you would trust him. And you can think about how that applies to anything, right? Any kind of written or spoken thing has some kind of ethos. And thinking about how you can trust it is important. It's something that you guys did in your journals this week. The second buzzword, also Greek, all three of these buzzwords are Greek, is pathos. And that has to do with your emotions. So when someone's speaking to you, are they drawing emotions out of you? When they're writing, are they drawing emotions out of you? And the exploration of pathos is pretty much you thinking about what emotions emerged from you as you were listening to a person speak or reading what they were writing, and then you questioning, how did they get me to feel that emotion? Because as a writer, sometimes you're going to want to communicate an emotion that's important to your argument. So you're going to want to know how to tap into that pathos, and how to communicate those emotions to people. And that's going to tie in strongly to this idea of showing instead of telling, which I'm going to talk about in a little while. So I'm sure you can think of examples in a story or when someone was speaking to you or in writing where your emotions were triggered, and I'm sure that in your journals you'll express where something really resonated with you. Maybe something that Wallace said made you angry, maybe something that he said made you kind of sad or guilty or whatever emotion rose up. Our responsibility under pathos, that idea, is to ask why we felt that way. Did the writer want us to feel that way, or are we resisting what the writer or speaker is saying to us? Because if we're resisting it and misinterpreting what the writer meant for us to feel, maybe the onus is on us to change a little bit. Maybe we're misunderstanding. But if the writer successfully communicated an emotion to us, it can be really, really impactful. Think about the last movie that you went to that really made you sad or cry, or if you're not a crier, just made you sad. There was a series of events, aesthetically and in terms of storytelling, that got you to the point of feeling that emotion. And good writers can make that happen. Good readers can pick up on it. When you're viewing something, you have a much more immediate and visceral response to what you're viewing. Maybe the emotions get drawn out more quickly. But in reading, you're using your imagination so much more. You're the one who's imagining the whole world instead of seeing it. So the same story can be happening, but you're the one imagining it. And if you're imagining it well, those emotions will still come through. And often in writing, specific ways of writing can make those emotions hit you deeper and harder than anything you view. It's very interesting. So that's pathos. And we'll move along here right to the last of the three Greek terms that you'll hear thrown around in composition that we're also working on in this class, and that's logos, or logic is what we call it today. And logic is what it sounds like. Does this make sense? Does this idea connect to this idea in a way where there's no big gaps that would make me question whether or not this thing is true? So I asked you in one of your journals for Wallace to mess around with logos and take the two pages near the end where he describes the science behind lobsters and pain, and I've asked you to recreate that and to see if it stands up or if it seems like a weak explanation, part of his argument, right? He's just honestly exploring the logic behind pain and lobsters, animal suffering, as far as humans know. And logic can be one of the hardest things. I'm sure if you've taken a philosophy class where it's largely logic and there's not much storytelling, you've probably experienced how hard it is to wrap your head around ideas that are complicated, that you don't have a basis for. So another huge part of reading, huge part of this whole ethos, pathos, logos is logic. You ask yourself, do I trust this person? How are my emotions being manipulated? I don't mean that in a bad way, but just how are my emotions coming up? How am I reacting? And is that intended or not? Is it good or not? And then logic. Does this all tie together? Does the logic and the ethos balance out with the pathos? How strong is this argument? Those are kind of how the ways we judge that, how strong something is, in the English anyway. So those are the things you'll be practicing. And you'll notice I won't use those words very often, but I'll try to bring them back up from time to time because they will be useful as you go into other classes. They're kind of keywords that catch all of those things I just talked about. We practice the abstract and the concrete. And I wanted to put this in other terms that maybe make the abstract and the concrete more valuable to you, make more sense to you. The abstract and the concrete exist everywhere, it just has different names. So for instance, if you're making an argument, you are all probably very familiar with argumentative papers. Your abstract and concrete are there. Your abstract is a claim, a thesis. This is true, or we should do this. On its own, very unconvincing. But your concrete is all the examples, the scientific evidence, the people you cite, the reasoning you use that's very specific, that supports that big abstract statement. And you'll find in most arguments you have a few little abstract arguments that build up to your big abstract argument. And you need your evidence, your concrete evidence for everything there. So the concrete and the abstract, when we're talking in terms of exploratory essays like you're reading this week and personal narratives in these genres, It's the same principle, it's just different. Because instead of citing scientific articles to prove a thesis, you're saying, I learned or discovered this idea, and here are the stories, the evidence, the concrete that shows you how I got there. You judge my evidence for yourself and see if you can also learn this thing and agree with it. So it's the same principles happening there. But I want you to think outside of just your classical argumentative, because the classical argumentative is dualistic. It's, I'm arguing for this generally, I'm arguing for this, you're arguing for this, evidence on both sides, and we fight. It's not always like that, but that's how the classic argument's set up. We're fighting, we're arguing with each other, right? But these same principles of the abstract and the concrete get carried over into stories with things that you can't prove. Doty this week is going to make the case in his essay that all of the beauty of humanity comes from us being not individuals, but from us all being pretty much common, pretty much the same, and that that's actually beautiful. That's hard to wrap your head around, and he has his own reasoning for why he thinks that. But that kind of abstract statement isn't something we can objectively prove. People have argued over such theses as Doty's for thousands of years. We have it all recorded. And no one's ever been able to objectively prove that. The humanities don't generally explore the things that are objectively proved. We explore the things that are subjective truths, but that are still integral to your life, how you live, how you understand yourself, why you get out of bed every day. I mean, man, that's why I study. So that's the importance of the abstract and the concrete in terms of what you guys will be doing and what you have been doing, which you'll be practicing this week. You've also been practicing annotating this week, and that's just a conversation with the text. Annotation's important because you should be treating text that you're reading like a conversation with a real living person. They've thoughtfully taken you through a whole bunch of ideas, and now you have your chance to ask clarification questions. What did that mean? What did that mean? Why did you mention this thing after that thing? So like with Wallace, maybe you're annotating in the Consider the Lobster essay, and you're like, whoa, why the heck did he move from describing a festival to talking about the scientific and historic attributes of the lobster? That's a really good question, and Wallace has thought about that question. He structured the essay in such a way that if you ask that question, you can come up with answers. One of those answers being that he wants to move from you thinking about the lobster as just something that you buy and eat and enjoy to as another living creature with a history that's been studied that maybe hasn't always been attractive. The more you understand about something, the better you can think through the consequences of what you do to it or with it. And it's a hard thing to convince some people because it's something you have to experience. But being shown that and being allowed to ask those questions is often much more interesting than just being told. If Wallace would have just explained everything, just in the terms of the prompt for Essay 1 this week, just told you everything, it would have been really dry and boring, and a lot of his evidence, his experiential evidence of going through and seeing and feeling things wouldn't matter, because telling someone something doesn't communicate those feelings, doesn't communicate those thoughts very well. So instead, there's mystery often in good writing. Why is this here? What does this mean? With personal narratives and essays, you're asked to notice those kind of funny things and ask questions and then come to interpretations, and maybe there's a few different interpretations. But that's part of the fun of the process of thinking through it all. And as you're going through the feelings, stepping into the person's shoes, experiencing it, asking questions and engaging with it, you're now taking it personally. When you're just reading a description of something, you can just say, well, that's someone else's experience, that's something objective, that's something that doesn't concern me. But when you're in their shoes, experiencing what they're experiencing, and they leave little question spots open, you have all of this room to dig in and engage and ask questions, and that's where most of the enjoyment in the arts is realizing that not everything is straightforward, that it involves you personally on some level, and that good authors often give us places to explore and question. Because in doing that, in not telling and in showing, in doing the things like Wallace did that we're just talking about, you also have space to disagree with that author, but not to argue with them. Because you understand that they're not trying to force something down your throat. They're presenting something to you the way they saw it, and gives you room to add, oh, but I see it this way, and we can discuss that like in a classroom setting, right? And it's what I'll do is I respond to you in your journals. I hope that made sense. I know it's a hard concept to explain, but annotating should be you asking questions about what does this word mean? Why did we have this transition here? Maybe you read a whole page and you don't understand it or understand why it's there. Ask why it's there. A lot of good reading, most good reading, will answer those questions as you think about it. It'll be really exciting. But those questions are also useful as you're judging things that aren't well written, because it'll help you see that, wow, this author didn't really know what they were doing. It's kind of, maybe I shouldn't trust them so much. So that leads me into essay 1, which is talking about showing and not telling. And this is huge. It's something you're going to be graded for on largely in essay number 1. Like I was saying, in a narrative, showing is the evidence. So put us in your shoes. You're going to read these examples of essays of past students I've had that I put up. Notice how they show you. They put you in their shoes. They tell you where they're walking. They ask you to experience what they're experiencing. And you can move to the Doty essay this week, or to the Wallace essay from last week. Doty kind of structures his essay almost every other paragraph. So he'll, first paragraph, show you something, put you there, narrate it, and then the next paragraph will kind of explain his thoughts on it. And then he'll show you something, and then he'll explain his thoughts. So he's moving from showing to telling, he's moving from the abstract to the concrete, right? He's putting you in a place, he's giving it form, making it specific, and then when he gives you an abstract thought, like death is this, right? Like he gets by the end of the essay, it makes sense to you in a way that it wouldn't have, because you have these stories that inform it, that give it meaning, right? That's how we construct meaning in storytelling. Just imagine your favorite TV show. Imagine an episode of Breaking Bad or something that's extremely emotionally charged. And just imagine if instead of it being 30 minutes of the story unraveling, you being in these characters' shoes, seeing what they do, asking why they're doing what they're doing. Instead of that, you just get a paragraph on the screen for the half hour that says, in this episode, Walter goes to Mexico, shoots someone, and comes home. That little summary of the episode, that telling of what happened in the episode means like nothing, right? Who cares if that happened? We're tuning into the show to see how it happened, right? So as you're writing your essay, we want to see how things are happening, and then you can, out of that, explain to us kind of what you think it means. That's that balance of the abstract and the concrete, showing us and then kind of telling us what it means. Show us and tell us what it means. That way, just like an argument, we can judge your evidence and see if your conclusions stand up and if they relate to us, right? And that's how you can communicate a subjective or personal truth to someone else. Little Seagull Handbook readings this week. They talk about structure. Like I was saying earlier, play with that structure. It presents you with like 3 to 5 different ways to structure an essay, chronologically, right? So from start to end of what happened, or maybe you start at the end and then you tell other stories and then you end somewhere else. Like you guys are going to be telling stories in your essay, your personal narrative, and you're going to be telling different little stories, because I'm asking you to tell me a story of something that changed your life, a moment where you were doing something and boom, your life changed. I want a story of how you were before that. So think like months, maybe years before that. How were you in relation to it? And then I want a story of how you are now, right? I want to see a story of how you've changed. That's the structure of this essay. I want you to think about the biggest moment that comes to mind that changed your life, and we're just going to ask why. Why is that such a big moment? Why does that come to your mind very first when you start thinking of life-changing moments? I'm going to ask you to write the story of what happened. Put us in your shoes. And then I'm going to ask you to consider, how were you different before that event? And then how are you different now after that event? And in seeing how you were different before and after that big event that sticks out to you, you can start to name exactly what you learned. And being able to name what you learned allows you to share it with others, which is just a beautiful experience. I mean, that's art, isn't it? It's great. That's the kind of writing skills and passion and mystery I want you to take out of this class. I want to end this video this week by talking about Souls on Ice, because it's a very strange essay and I want to give you some footing in it. Generally in class, I would sit us all down in a circle, I'd ask some questions, we'd work through a couple paragraphs and figure out what they mean, because I'm sure as you're reading this essay, you're going to be like, I don't even know what the person said in this paragraph. But I want you to remember that each paragraph is like a fence around words that contains a main idea, right? So if you can pick out that main idea and then figure out why all the other sentences are there, that's how you understand writing. Boom, you'll get it. So ask yourself, what's the main idea of this paragraph? How do these other sentences help me understand it? Because they're there for a reason too. Souls on Ice, at its core, is an exploration of how do we make art. Specifically for Dodi, how do I write a poem? He's a poet. You'll notice that at the very end of the document there's a poem. Dodi wrote that poem and then he went back and wrote the essay explaining how he wrote the poem. I know poetry is really scary, daunting, intimidating for people. I get that, it's very strange. It's people speaking in a way that they would never speak in real life, right? Dodi's writing lines like sentences, right? Lines of poetry that are only a few words long. We don't talk like that. But he explains how writing that way helps him think differently. Poetry is really freedom. It's very strange, but the structure of poetry is really freedom to isolate ideas, put them next to each other line by line, and then the poet can ask, wow, how do these ideas relate to each other? And if they can do that well and figure something out, then other people can also read that, ask how do these lines relate to each other, and learn something really cool. So, interestingly, in this essay, Dodi teaches us what the poem's supposed to be saying to us. Most poetry doesn't do that, but it's really cool, really interesting for us to see how the creative process, his poetry, works. Maybe it'll help you if you ever encounter other poetry, understand the poetry that you encounter. It's really not supposed to be scary or frustrating. It's really supposed to be an exploration, and that's going to be at the core of this class. I've said it so many times already. Structure is nice and it makes us feel safe and it helps us communicate, but without the exploration, the messiness, the failing, the art that's confusing, we don't even get the ideas worth communicating in the first place. We don't even necessarily care about what we're reading, right? How many textbooks have you read that you didn't care about? You just filled out prompts for a grade. I'm doing my best to make that not the case for this class. I can't stand that. I want things to be meaningful and connect to how you interpret your life. Hopefully this class sticks with you in that way. So the main idea for Dodi anyway, and this main idea is going to really influence how you write your first essay, is things that inspire us. What can they teach us? So you'll notice right away, Dodi starts by describing a little gas station, right, somewhere in Massachusetts, I think. And he talks about how he was walking through the supermarket and some fish caught his eye. This fish, dead, laid out on the ice, sparkling, caught his eye and just mesmerized him, right? He was just like, whoa, that looks really crazy. I'm sure that's happened to you. I go hiking all the time and I'm often like really in the mode, but once in a while I'll come around a corner and see a waterfall or spot like a really beautiful bird on a branch that I've never seen before and just get awestruck by it, right? Boom, that thing's there, you see it. There's a bunch of things around you, but that one thing really just goes straight to your mind and awes you. It's crazy, right? So Dodi pretty much, the premise of his essay here and why he wrote the poem is that thing caught my attention and really mesmerized me. And I appreciate that, but maybe it can teach me something. And this is the same thing I'm asking you to do in essay 1. I'm asking you to think back on a memory, something that changed your life, right? The first thing that pops into your mind where you're like, life-changing, boom, I got this awe-inspiring moment. I'm asking you to name that and then go, well, what was it about that that was so important? Why did it stick out to me? Doty says really early in the essay that people need containers for their ideas. That's a really interesting line. See, he says, our metaphors go ahead of us. I'm reading it down here. They know before we do. He's saying that something inside of us knows when we're about to learn something and registers it, but then we have to put in work to figure out what that is. It's a strange thought, right? But think about this. So psychologists have proven over many years that our brains don't really enjoy learning some new things naturally. If there's an idea that we can realize it subconsciously and suppress it. So you can kind of know something and not know it. It's very strange, but you can think about it this way. When you learn something that changes your life, something about death, right? Like Doty's learning. Something about spirituality, something about ethics, right? How should I act in the world? Your brain wants to resist that because your brain isn't quite, you aren't quite ready for the implications of learning that thing. You think about it, you learn something that changes your ethical outlook. Say you read Considerable Lobster and like, I'm never eating lobsters again, right? To get to that place, you had to admit to yourself, which is very hard, that you believe that all of the years you spent eating that kind of food were wrong, that you were wrong, and now you have to make a life change and you have to not eat it anymore. And if you love eating it, how hard is that, right? So you can think about that with anything that you learn. You die to yourself. You actually die. Parts of you die away. The part of you that thought something was okay, the part of you that wouldn't face death, that wouldn't face this reality inside of you has to die. And you have to be okay with a new thing coming out, which requires work. So there's all this work you have to do of admitting this was wrong, that you live this way, working towards living the right way in the future. And imagine, like, the older you get, if you learn something like this, imagine letting 30, 40 years of how you've lived your life go, just saying, I lived it wrong. Oh, so hard to do. And you have to make a habit out of doing it, otherwise you're probably not going to do it, man. I took a class on midlife crises in psychology and literature, and I mean, it's not all the time. Midlife crisis is complicated, but so much of the time it has to do with realizing that a goal you had actually didn't satisfy you, or that that goal you had's beyond you. You're not even good enough to obtain it. And you have to reassess that, 40, 50 years of your life and be like, man, what was I living for? I'm not as good as I thought I was, or this thing isn't satisfying. What am I going to do now? So you have to die to parts of yourself and let new parts emerge and work on them. It's very difficult. So Doty says that we need to go about this in a very careful way because it's a painful, hard process. If you ever realized something really hard, maybe someone close to you has died, and this happened to me, you realize something about maybe the finality of death and how it's just around the corner, something like that. Maybe that sent you into a depression. I mean, sometimes we learn truths we're not ready to handle. There's a famous play called A Streetcar Named Desire where the main character is living in an illusion. And the whole play, the audience is kind of thinking, man, I wish she'd stop living in this illusion. It's absurd. Her life looks crazy. Blanche Dubois. I mean, you can't exist like this, you know? No one respects her. But at the end, someone, one of the other main characters, Stanley, forces the truth down her throat. And she can't handle it. She goes mentally insane and gets sent to an asylum. Sometimes we can't handle it when it's forced on us, right? There's some great artists like T.S. Eliot or thinking of the author of Howl, Allen Ginsberg. They learned something at some point in their life that broke them, and they went to a mental asylum for a while because they were so depressed they couldn't handle it. So Doty says we need to approach truth kind of carefully because we don't want to break ourselves. So he says when you see something that sparks your mind like that, or like what I'm asking you to do with this essay, there's some kind of truth in there that you can go explore and find. But if you're the one exploring it, if you're easing into it, if you're holding it at a distance, here's these fish, I'm going to explore these fish, let's look at them a little bit at a time, then that truth can sink into you in a way that you can integrate it, that doesn't just hit you and blind you, just like the sun hitting your eyes, right? Too much. So that's kind of what Dodi's getting at with what he's doing with art. And then the beautiful thing is, as he's exploring it in this way, he's also crafting a poem and an essay, which he can share with us, and we can think through his thoughts, which he's got some really interesting thoughts. So I hope that helps you guys as you're working through your upcoming essay and as you're getting to terms with this essay.